All right, guys. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm going to try something different here. I'm going to try to present these notes kind of like I do at school, just using the PowerPoint. Um, I'll send you a revised copy of this, and you can just kind of fill these in um, as you go. Um, Here in this chapter, we're basically going to combine the first two sections together and then the last two sections together. Sections 1 and 2 are dealing with the North. Sections 3 and 4 are dealing with the South. And so I've combined sections 1 and 2 together, and they're not really in the order of the sections. I've just kind of combined all the information together to try to make it fit. And I'll do the same thing with the last two sections as well. And then we'll have a short test over this next week sometime, but I'll let you know about that later. Okay. So let's get started. We talked previously about how there were three main regions when it came to the United States. We talked about the North, we talked about the South, we talked about the West. And in the last chapter, we kind of dealt with more of the West, Texas becoming a state, the Mexican cession, gaining all that, the Oregon country, just getting all that land that we did. And now we're going to turn our focus to more the North and the South, because that's where the majority of the population lives when it comes to the United States at this point in time. Okay, so when it came to the North, we talked previously about the Industrial Revolution. We actually talked about that before we left school. The Industrial Revolution is going to play a huge role and have a huge impact on the United States. But it's definitely going to play a much bigger role when it comes to the North. Why is that? Well, most industry at this point in time was in the North. Okay, the South was known for its agriculture. The North had some agriculture, and we'll deal with a little bit of the agriculture in the North later. But industry, with the Industrial Revolution, is going to just boom when it comes to the North, because there is so much industry in the North. The effects of the Industrial Revolution will be felt there a whole lot more than in the South. Prior to the Industrial Revolution, one person would do all the work. So one person would spin the cotton fibers into thread. Then they would take that thread and they would weave that thread into a fabric. Then they would cut and sew that fabric together and make a shirt or pants or whatever it is they were making. And that one person did everything. Industrialization changes that forever. Okay, so when the Industrial Revolution started, there's going to be three phases when it comes to industrialization. Okay, and the first of those phases is that employers are going to start to divide jobs into smaller steps, or they're going to people are going to start to what's called specialize in a certain area, or specialization. So now one person will spend their entire day spinning fibers into thread, and that's all they do. Another person will spend their entire day weaving thread into fabric. Another person will spend their entire day just cutting and sewing the fabric into a shirt or whatever. So people start to specialize in one specific job. All right, that's the first phase. The second phase, and we've talked about the second phase in a previous chapter as well, when we talked about the factory system. Okay, the second phase was building these factories to bring all the people together under one roof in one spot. So now the thread is being spun, the fabric is being woven, the shirts are being sewn together, all in one single spot. It cut down a lot of the time. They could produce these things and they could ship them out to wherever they needed to ship them. With the Industrial Revolution, we talked about all the different machines that were built, the power looms. Trying trying to think what other ones we talked about. There were several that we mentioned. Okay, but when it came to the Industrial Revolution, the third phase was that workers no longer do those jobs; the machines do it, and the workers are just there to make sure the machines don't break down. So now, instead of spinning the fabric or the fibers into thread, or weaving the thread into fabric, they're watching the machines do those things and making sure that those machines are doing it correctly. That's going to play a huge role when it comes to industrialization in the North. One of those individuals, Elias Howe, with his invention of the sewing machine. We talked about some other individuals and some other machines that were created during this time, but his sewing machine, I think it was built in 1846, is going to cut down the time that different things can be made. They can be shipped out very quickly and sent to other parts of the country. So these machines and these things that are doing this are definitely going to be a positive when it comes to the North. By 1860, because of industrialization, the factories in the Northeast are going to be making at least 2/3 of the country's overall manufactured goods. So of all the goods that are going to be produced in the United States, Northeast factories are producing 2/3 of those. And we'll see how that's going to be when we get closer to the Civil War. That's actually going to be an advantage for the North being more industrial than the South. And we'll talk about all that in another chapter. Now, when it came to industrialization, it wasn't without its problems. Okay, working conditions worsened as the factory system developed. Some of those conditions, one, long hours led to accidents. People were working 11, 12, 13 hours a day. They're very tired. All these machines have moving parts. And it wasn't uncommon for a person to get a hand or a foot or something, clothing caught in a belt of one of the machines and lose a limb. That was just part of it. The long hours, they were tired, they weren't paying attention to what they were doing, and it led to accidents. Again, moving parts, big part of that. We just talked about that. Working conditions were not very good. I said long hours. There was no health insurance. They did not have the same benefits that we have today in our jobs. In the middle of summer, in the sweltering heat, they didn't have air conditioning, and in the winter they didn't have heat. So working under those conditions could be a bit of a task. So the working conditions were not very suitable for the individuals. To combat all of that, some groups started to form what were called unions or trade unions. And these trade unions were members of a similar job coming together. They would oftentimes go on strike, which meant they would stop working to try and get their demands, whatever those might be, shorter working hours, better pay, just anything that they wanted. They would strike, which at that time was illegal. You could not strike, but some of them did. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people were arrested because they went on strike. Because like I said, it was illegal at the time. But they did start to form unions later on. These unions will be successful in getting some benefits for the workers. That's not till the late early 1900s, especially like with child labor. At this point in time, children 10, 11, 12 years old are working just as much as the adults, working 12, 13-hour days, almost like a sweatshop basically, and working for very little money. And that'll all change later on with the child labor laws that'll come into play. Again, you'll learn about that in another history class. So improvements in transportation are going to contribute to the success of the new American industries. We've talked a little bit about transportation, new transportation that is coming about, but with some of the things we talk about here in just a second, goods are going to be able to be shipped a lot easier, a lot quicker, which then drives it's going to be a lot cheaper. It's going to drive the prices down for the American public to buy these products. So it's going to be good for everybody. One of those, which we've already talked about, was the steamboat. We mentioned that. We talked about the roads that were built, the canals that were built, hundreds of miles of canals. Okay, well, these canals that have been built, they're now trying to widen them and make them deeper so that these steamboats can travel on the canals. Previously, they were too big and they couldn't travel on these canals, but they're making to where they can. So the steamboat, we talked about Robert Fulton and his Clermont, the first steamboat in the United States, traveling up the Hudson River. Okay, so that's by 1860, there's going to be hundreds of steamboats traveling up canals, rivers, in the Great Lakes, all over the place. And we've talked a little bit about steamboats already. One we haven't talked about is clipper ships. And there'll be a picture on there in a second. You can see these clipper ships are going to cut travel basically in half. The route from New York to Great Britain usually took about 3 to 4 weeks. The use of clipper ships is going to cut that time in half to around 12 to 14 days. And that's why they were called clipper ships, because they clipped the amount of time that it took to travel certain places. Railroads. This is going to be a huge advantage when it comes to moving goods. In 1830, a man named Peter Cooper is going to build the first American steam-powered locomotive. In 1829, the year before, Britain had developed the first steam-powered locomotive. Peter Cooper's was called the Tom Thumb, and I'll show you a picture of it in just a second. But prior to the steam-powered locomotive, the railroads the tracks were put down. The trains it's not like a train like today, but it would be put on the track and it was pulled with horses. Horses would be on both sides and they would just be pulling the engines down the tracks. Well, now with steam power, they don't need those horses anymore, which is kind of funny because Peter Cooper, when he built his Tom Thumb, he challenged a horse-drawn locomotive to a race, and he actually lost because his engine broke. But they will tweak the engines. They'll make improvements to those, and railroads will become a huge thing all across the United States. By 1840, there will be 3,000 miles of railroad tracks crisscrossing the United States. With 3,000 miles, that's not very much. By 1860, excuse me, that will be 31,000 miles of tracks. So just in 20 years' time, you can see that it just explodes. A lot of that is going to be connecting the North to the Midwest. So the people in the Midwest growing their crops can now take their goods, put them on a train, ship them to wherever they need to go very easily. And again, that's good for the American public. It drives prices down because they can ship it cheaper. They still use river travel as well, but the railroads are going to be a huge advantage for the North. I'll show you some pictures here. There's the clipper ship and the Tom Thumb. Doesn't look like your average train or locomotive, but that's a replica of it, what it looked like right there. But the early trains looked something similar to that. So here's a picture here, and you can see the one on the left. It kind of keeps moving. It starts in like 1830, and you can just see how the railroads grow across the United States. And it's actually going to go into the 1900s, but you can see exactly where the majority of the railroads are and how that is in the North, the northern states, the Northeast. And again, that will be another advantage for the North when it comes to the Civil War, because now they have more railroads, more tracks. They can ship soldiers, weapons, all those things in wartime very easily. And we'll talk more about that at a later date. But you can see there just how it explodes across the country. All right, the growth of industry and railroads is also going to lead to a growth in cities. Like I said, the railroads are going to connect northern states to the Midwestern states. So places like St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, Louisville, which, those places were already growing because they were located on what, if you remember? Rivers. That's right. Okay. So because they're located on rivers, they're already growing a little bit, but with industry, with railroads, the population will explode. They'll grow. They'll become some of the larger cities in the United States at that time. With all of this, all the industry, all the growth, this creates a need for faster communication. At that point in time, if you wanted to talk to somebody, you had to write them a letter. It took a week or two to travel where it was going. That person would then write a letter back, send it back to you. It might be a month before you could communicate from one person and then back to that person again. Okay, so a man named Samuel Morse is going to create what was called the telegraph. And he figured out that he could take electrical wires and he could tap out messages on his telegraph, and the message would travel along these electrical wires to someone in another state, and you could communicate that way. By 1852, there's 23,000 miles of telegraph lines across the United States. They did that by using what was called Morse code. You can see Samuel Morse there in his telegraph, along with Morse code, but you would tap on that telegraph there, and it would send those messages somewhere else. The first message that was sent was from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, and the message was, "What hath God wrought?" That was the message that was sent. A few minutes later, that same message was sent back. They realized it had worked. They realized the telegraph is a success. Like I said, by 1852, there are thousands of miles of telegraph lines across the United States. Now you can send a message in minutes that once took 2 weeks. So it was a huge deal for the United States. Of course, now we all have, like I said before, small computers in our pockets with our cell phones, and we couldn't imagine having to tap out letters with that thing. But at that point in time, that was a big deal. All right, some farming innovations. The North was not strictly industrial. Okay, they did farm, and we've talked about some of those things. The growth of wheat, corn, some of those things that took off in the Midwestern states. And we talked about that in another chapter as well. But as more and more people are moving west, especially when they cross the Mississippi into the Great Plains, they're going to need some of these farming innovations. And there were 3 in the 1840s and 50s that will come about. The first was developed by a man named, who you've probably heard of, John Deere. You see his tractors in stores all over the place. My brother-in-law actually works at the John Deere store over in Kensett. But his first invention was the steel-tipped plow. And this was huge because when it came to the soil in the Midwestern states and the Great Plains, it was the roots of the grasses were so thick, it was very hard to cut through. So his steel-tipped plow made it easy to rip through that soil to where they could plant their wheat or corn or whatever it is that they wanted to plant. Next, you had Cyrus McCormick, who developed what was called the mechanical reaper. Prior to the mechanical reaper, when it was time to harvest your crops, you went out with your sickle or your knives or whatever, and you would chop down the wheat by hand. That could take weeks to cut down your crop and harvest it. The mechanical reaper could, harvest an entire crop in one day. So because you can harvest your crop quicker, you can now plant more, which means you can sell more, you make more money. The last invention was the threshing machine. The threshing machine is what took the grain on the wheat and it separated it from the stalk. So you didn't have to pull all the grain off by hand anymore. The threshing machine did it for you, and again, it made life a whole lot easier. Again, here's some pictures of those inventions. There's the steel-tipped plow by John Deere. This is a replica of the mechanical reaper. Again, not what you would picture today, but it was pulled by a horse, and this thing here would turn. This thing up in the top right corner there would turn, and it would cut the grain, and then it would just kind of slide off of that metal plate there, and then they'd come back and they'd bind it up later. And the threshing machine looked something kind of like this. Like I said, it would take the grain off of the stalk of the wheat for you, so you didn't have to do it by hand. But again, these innovations are going to lead to more and more people moving west into the Midwestern states, into the Great Plains, and cause some of those cities to grow because of that as well. But even though farming is growing, industry is growing even faster than farming was. All right, last slide here. Several groups are going to face discrimination in the North. If you don't know what discrimination is, it means they look down upon, they're looked at differently by other people. People feel like they shouldn't have the same rights as them. So we're going to talk about some of those groups. The first group, obviously, because we know how they were viewed at that time, was African Americans. Now, slavery had pretty much ended in the North in about 1830. So if there were free African Americans living in the North, they weren't slaves, but they still did not have the same freedoms that white people did. They could not vote. They could not attend public schools. They kind of had their own schools. They couldn't use certain public services. Hospitals, they'd have to go to a hospital strictly for them. So they were discriminated against, and that's going to go on really until the mid 1900s. Not just in the North, but the North and the South as well. And that, when you get to another history class, you'll learn a lot about the civil rights movement and all that. That's what all that's going to be dealing with. Women are going to be discriminated against. They will work the same jobs as men, but be paid half as much. Employers thought that because they were women, they didn't have to pay them as much, even though they're doing the exact same work as a man. When it came to the unions, the women could not join these unions. So only the men could do that, and the men got paid a whole lot more as well. The last group is going to be immigrants. There are going to be hundreds of thousands of immigrants that come to the United States between 1840 and 1860. The majority of those will come from Ireland and Germany. In the mid 1800s, you'll have what's called the Irish potato famine. Over 1 million people in Ireland will die from starvation because of this famine. So a lot of people will migrate to America and Germany as well. But immigrants were looked down upon. We're going to talk a little bit about why they were viewed the way that they were. A lot of people believe that immigrants threatened the future of native or American-born citizens. They're gonna blame immigrants for basically all the problems of society. Everything that's bad, it's because of immigration. If they weren't here, things would be better. These people are called nativists. These people who are threatened by immigrants coming to the United States. These nativists. So they're gonna blame immigrants for all of society's problems. It's the immigrants' fault that there's homeless people. It's the immigrants' fault that I can't go get a job somewhere. They're taking my job. The next one there, they accused immigrants of taking jobs from real Americans. I was born here in America. I should have that job before this immigrant does. But a lot of employers would hire immigrants because they felt like they could pay them less. So you hire an immigrant, you pay him half what you're paying an American citizen, and getting the same amount of work out of them. They also blamed them for bringing crime and disease to the United States. The diseases that were running through large cities, smallpox, whatever it was, it got here because of immigration. The immigrants brought it over with them. So immigrants are going to be looked down upon by Americans. But a lot of the things that immigrants bring with them, their culture, their language, their religions, a lot of that will be good for America. People will see some of the things that they bring with them, and they'll start to change and adapt or adopt some of those things here in America. It wasn't all bad. A lot of people just blame them for the problems that were going on here in America. In 1849, there's going to be the formation of a new political party. A lot of these nativists, or these people who were against immigration, are going to form this new political party. It was kind of a secret party because people would ask members of this party, what's your party stand for? What do you believe? Well, these individuals would just tell them, I don't know anything. I know nothing. Well, they got the nickname, the Know Nothing Party, because anytime that they were asked, they would just tell somebody, I don't know anything. I don't know what you're talking about. I know nothing. So this Know Nothing Party will come about because of the issues dealing with immigration. It won't be around just for a real long time. But there is this new political party that's formed. It's actually given the official name, the American Party, shortly after 1849. But originally it was called the Know Nothing Party because they said they don't know anything about what people are talking about. They were very secretive. So, all right. So there's your notes for sections 1 and 2. You can fill those out, and I'll be posting 3 and 4 later, dealing with the South. I can figure out how to stop this.